So children are a gift from God, and we as parents are to train them up in the way they should go. But how? Let's talk about it in an all-new episode of C28. I'm pumped for this episode. I have a special guest, a very, very special guest. Let me read what I wrote here as an intro for you because I want to make sure and do it right. I've invited a guest on to discuss this topic with me who is absolutely qualified to speak on the subject. She is a mother of 5 kids, ages 2 to 11. She also owns her own business called Gold Country Doula, where she supports mothers and fathers in the birthing journey. She has supported over 100 births in the last several years and has assisted with other women getting into the doula business as well. Additionally, she has led and been a part of several studies with Christian women over the last decade and is currently leading another study on parenting by reading through Paul Tripp's book called Parenting with several ladies from our church. She humbly learns from other mothers, old and young, and selflessly leads the charge in helping others on their journey in parenting as well. This guest is Emily Campbell. She is my wife. Emily, take a minute and introduce yourself.
Well, that kind of covered it.
Well, it looks like I did a pretty good job.
That's about it. But yeah, I'm Emily. I am your number one fan, by the way.
Nice.
Yeah. There's a couple people competing for that title, but I will always hold it. So,
yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
You will always be my hardest number one.
Yeah. So we have 5 kids. We homeschool them. Doula business that keeps me busy too, and following you around sometimes.
She's I don't know if you know this about her, but she's a planner. That's why she has 13 note cards in front of her, a notebook, and the book that she's doing the study through. So she is, I think, well prepared. Yeah. I don't know if we have time for all those notes, babe.
No, I took more notes than I knew I would need. It's a good book. So there's lots of good quotes in there, and I had lots of thoughts. So.
Well, awesome. I mean, one of the first questions I thought we could talk about, first, kind of where the conversation came from. One is, and you can, talk a little bit about this too in a minute, but it seems like there is not only is it a good thing to discuss because parenting is so important, but also it has turned out to be kind of controversial in some areas about how to parent. And there's 1,000 books on how to parent, and they're all very different. And we have friends who try to take 5 different books and try to blend them all together and use that. And then other people that find one that they just jive with and they go for it. We have had people in church services very upset with what pastors said about parenting and the way that they parent. And then also people have been transformed by what they have heard within church circles about parenting. And so in that sense, I think it's a hot topic and probably always will be until Jesus comes back.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think the hard part is it's not like the Bible gives us like this list of instructions of like, you do this and you do this, and then you're supposed to do that. It gives us a lot of direction of this is where I want you to go with it. But it doesn't say like, if your kids talk back, this is how you handle it.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. You're right.
Yeah, that's not in there.
Yeah.
And so I think that talking with a lot of parents, we've heard this idea of like, I just wish the Bible would give me very, very clear instructions on how to deal with these problems day to day in like the little moments with my kids. And there's not that. And so we have to navigate within each individual family that we have what our kids are needing. And even within those individual families, you have to change it and adapt it to each individual kid. Because what one kid's going to need might not be a problem for your other kid. And so this idea of like, this is how you should parent, it's not a blanket fix for everybody.
Yeah. For instance, I just was talking to somebody about parenting stuff, about this podcast coming up. And I said, we have a family friend who's up in Washington that has several kids. I think it was 5 kids. And they say, we raised them all the same, and all the kids headed off in the similar direction, and then one did not. And that person responded to me saying, see, that's the problem. You can't parent your kids all the same because they're not all the same. So you're saying even within those families, there's like this, you got to be ready to pivot and pivot and pivot, but you can't leave these, what we'd hope would be these principles given in the Bible about how to parent. So there's a lot of flexibility within parenting, but there's these general principles that we have to stand upon. Yeah.
I think like the foundation is going to be the same. We're parenting them from this place of having the intent to point them towards Christ, and it's just going to look different of how each kid needs you to do that. And so, we have, 2 kids that are really similar in their personality, and what works for them is completely opposite in a lot of ways of what works for 2 of the others. And who knows what the last one will do. She's a wild card in a lot of sense. So
yeah, she is. She told me, she looked at my face, and I hadn't shaved for a while, and she said, "Why do you have that?"
Take it off.
I'm like, well, it's just, it's my beard. I just leave it on every now and then. She goes, "You need to scrape that off." I think she's seen me shave or something, and it just looks like I'm scraping it off or something.
She's pretty judgmental.
Yeah. And also, instead of saying, "Hey, can I sit there with you?" or "Can you please move over?" she gets up and looks at you and says, "Scoot."
Yeah.
Like, okay.
Yeah. I'm doing a really good job with her.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So one thing I like to start the podcast off with, because there's a bunch of general advice, and I think that in podcasts that's helpful, but I always like to start off like, what are the biblical precedences or foundations that we're working with? So a question would be, as we start talking about parenting, we would ask, is it even in the Bible before we can even have a conversation about biblical parenting? Does the Bible address it? And so did you have anything on that, or did you want me to start off? You could chime in.
You can start off.
Okay. So I think the Bible has a lot to say about parenting, even more so. This whole podcast is structured typically around no preparation, raw conversation, no edits. And so the preparation I do for this is very minimal.
Me too.
Yeah, you got all these, like, you probably rewrote your note cards in pretty handwriting, didn't you?
I rewrote these notes, the note cards.
Oh, that's what you're doing when you got here, huh?
Yeah.
You're rewriting some. Oh, okay. So anyways, here's a couple things just for our listeners and ourselves so that we can kind of calibrate ourselves on what the Bible has to say, and then use that as kind of a springboard off into principles and advice and encouragement and things like that. So in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, it says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations." And so in the specific example in Jeremiah, there's this intentionality before he's appointed to a prophet of the nations, goes back to even like this care and intentionality in the womb and knowing him before he was in the womb. Many of us know Psalms 139 verses 13 through 14. It says, "For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well." Again, what we see is children, they're not accidents, as much as sometimes we may call them an accident. But on God's part, they're not accidents. They're not like, oh, another baby snuck into the world without me knowing it. God knows, and I believe has some level of sustaining life, even in that sense. And if he knew us beforehand, I mean, and the thoughts of us outnumber the grain of sand on the beach, then that what it's communicating is that children are not this secondary cause and adults are the real world. That children are very much known by God. They aren't accidents. They're intentional, and they are brought into the earth as part of even a command back in the garden, and then outside of the garden as well. And so my first point is the Bible talks about children and eventually parenting is that these kids aren't accidents. I think it's good to remember that they're not like God only cares about adults, because to be honest, a lot of adults, the way we operate in our life is that we more engage adults and we care about adults and kids. How many kids do you have? I don't know. There's like 15, there's 13 over, I don't know, but they're just kids, and God doesn't really see it like that. I don't think so. They're intentional, and we're supposed to be intentional with them. Also, there's this a lot of talk about training and teaching. In Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6, train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart it. Proverbs chapter 1, verses 8 through 9, hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck. That's a beautiful verse. And I wish it would take root in my child's heart. But that is spoken from a place of protection for children, as even kids are going to be enticed to sin. Young ones are going to be enticed to sin. And the advice given is hear your father's instruction and don't forsake your mother's teaching, and that will help them in their life avoid sin. Again, the training and teaching, it's commanded, it's talked about, it's instructed from a biblical standpoint. And so teaching and training is also in there. Also, children are a blessing, whether we always admit it or not. Psalms 127, chapter 127, verse 3, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies at the gate. Now, I don't know what necessarily the enemies at the gate situation is, but I know my quiver's full and I'm ready for the enemy at the gate then. But
I feel like there's enemies at my gate. They're usually my kids, but
they're on the wrong side of the gate.
I think I can relate to that sometimes.
What are you guys doing out there?
Yeah. Let me in.
Yeah. Okay. So there's some other blessings. Proverbs 17, verse 6, even talking about grandchildren and children are blessings.
That's kind of what I'm parenting for, by the way.
Grandchildren.
Yeah.
You're looking forward to that.
Yeah. People have asked me before, like, what's your favorite part of parenting? And like jokingly, I'm like, I just really want lots of grandkids because everybody promises me that that's going to be like the best. So it is a joke. I like being a mom.
Yeah.
But I'm really excited to be a grandma, and out of 5 kids, I better get a couple.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure you will. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, and I think that I can see how grandparents are formed, with all the lackadaisical candy giving. Like even with our youngest, I feel like I'm a lot more lackadaisical with it. Like, oh, you found some chocolate chips, just eat them.
Yeah.
Just take care of them. Yeah.
You definitely have softened over time.
Maybe.
Especially, we had a girl and then we had 3 boys and then we ended with a girl. And I think like in the middle there, you became like this rock solid boy dad where you got in this rut of, this is the way I parent.
Is this like roast Bryan day?
And then
Any other
Lexi
ruts
came
you
along.
want to talk about?
Lexi came along and it was just like, whatever you want. Like,
you want me to scoot? I'll scoot. Just tell me.
You want more candy? Go ahead.
Who am I to take the lollipop away? Yeah. Well, anyways, Proverbs 17 talks about grandchildren being the crown of the age, and the glory of children is their fathers and things like that. Deuteronomy goes on, just for the sake of time, I'll skip over that. Deuteronomy chapter 5, it talks about the 10 commandments and then goes on to say in verse 29, that they had such a heart as this always to fear me and to keep all my commands, that it might go well with them and with their descendants or with their children forever. And so even in Deuteronomy chapter 5, there's this looking out for the kids even in that, and how it'll go well with them. And then Ephesians chapter 6, New Testament verse that carries out after Deuteronomy chapter 5. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is a commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And anyways, it goes on, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 through 7. Also, there's speaking of discipling them. Proverbs 29, verse 17. Proverbs 13, verse 24. Hebrews 12, verse 6. Discipling and disciplining them. Hebrews 12 is one that we know very well. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord. Do not be weary when reproved by them, for the Lord disciplines the ones that he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. And so similarly, Proverbs 13:24, whoever spares the rod hates their son, but whoever loves him is diligent. So we got discipline, we got discipleship, we have instruction, we have children's our blessing. We're to train and teach them. They're not accidents. And then we're also put in charge of them to do certain things of that teaching and raising them up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. And so then our question, if it's in the Bible, we're supposed to be doing these things. Emily, help me out here. How do we do it?
I don't know. I'm still figuring that out.
And that's it. We're gonna. No, we got some good stuff here. Let's talk about it. Go ahead.
I think, even when you kind of brought up biblical parenting as a subject, at first I was like, geez, that seems so broad. Like, where do you even start? It just feels like there's so many little, rabbit trails that you could potentially take it down of like, parents want to know about how do I raise these toddlers, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's parents of teens that are like, how do I raise these teenagers? And mm-hmm. then there's parents of adults that are like, they're raised, but I'm still parenting them. How mm-hmm. do I like navigate that place? And so, I think, I'm limited in some ways of, this advice that I can give because I only have parented up to the age of almost 12. Mm-hmm. But I think foundationally, like we said before, it's always going to be the same of how are we trying to lead our kids towards Christ in all those decisions that they're making. And I think it starts, for me at least, with really sitting down and saying, what are my intents? What is the intent I have for my kids? Like, what is my hope and my goals for them? And I think when I first started parenting, I would have said things like, oh, I want them to be really kind toddlers. I really hope they never hit each other. And then very quickly I was like, okay, well, that happened. Mm-hmm. So
they're all Vikings. Yeah.
Yeah. And then they got a little older and I was like, oh, well, I hope they get good grades. Right. And then like, what are they going to do when they grow up? Because kids get asked that from like 5 years old. They're like, what are you going to do when you grow up? Right. Mm-hmm. And so then I was like, oh, well, I need to help them decide what they want to do as a career. And I think when I stepped back, that is a lot of the intent of parenting as far as a secular goal of like, we want them to be, outstanding citizens that mm-hmm. are contributing to their community. Mm-hmm. I want them to have a successful job. I want them to get good grades. And that's kind of like the success of the world as far as parenting goes. But I think what I realized in biblical parenting is that I wanted to raise up my kids to hopefully follow after Christ's plan for them in their life. And so, that's more than just, I hope they get baptized. I hope they go to church on Sunday. I hope all these things, like they go on mission trips and, the little boxes that we kind of check mm-hmm. as we grow. But really at the end of the day, if I'm like, what's my number one goal as a parent? I think really it's that I want to lead them towards this surrendering in their lives to Christ, of saying like, whatever you have for me, that's where I'll go. And sometimes that doesn't look like a successful
nice
career, right?
Yeah.
That might not look like $1 million bank account. But I think that what I desire for my kids is to be in the will of God. And if that's where they are at, I think that, he will sustain them. And so, when I shifted my goals in that way, I think one, it gave me a lot of peace because I'm like, in the end, I have no power to change my kid's heart, right? Like the ability to draw them to Christ is not anything that I'm capable of. That's the work of God in their life. But my job is to really build up that knowledge of who he is to them, to foster like these conversations and these kids have a lot of like crazy deep conversations with me, even from like a young age that I don't think I was thinking of when I was younger. Mm-hmm. Like
you mean our kids specifically or kids in general?
I think kids in general, like for me, it's my kids specifically, right? But I talk to other moms that are like, my kid is asking me like these deep theological questions that I don't ever remember, considering at that age. But I think too, like we just have to live as an example day to day to our kids of what it looks like to surrender our lives to Christ, and hope that by that example, it draws them near to him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if I were to summarize a little bit, just to make sure I understood what you're saying there, you're saying that there's a secular success that we're all drawn to as parents in some way. It's like the good grades, good job, acts kindly with other people, contributes to society, and is a beneficial person to the people around them. And those things are not necessarily bad things, but you're saying that you've learned those aren't the primary purpose or the root of parenting. There's something else there. Mm-hmm.
So, as far as biblical parenting, yeah.
So what is, if those things are, could be very well and good things, but there's something else deeper, foundational that, because, you could train your kid maybe to be, this one could be an engineer, or this one could go into a trade school. And one's like, trade schools are for losers, or somebody's like, master's degrees are for boxes or squares. Dang it. So those you can kind of shift, but there's some foundational things as Christians that really matter far and beyond the things we just listed, right? What are those things that you're talking about that are kind of below the surface in biblical parenting that are kind of these stones that every parent should kind of stand on?
Right. Yeah. You asked that question, then my brain totally went blank. So then I just sat here and blinked at you.
I thought something was happening. I wasn't sure.
When you have like two thoughts that you're like trying to work through and then they just both disappear?
Oh, yeah.
That's what happened. Okay, ask me one more time. Or in a different way, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I'm probably not phrasing the question very well. So the idea is like there's these good secular things that every parent like hopes their kid, isn't necessarily homeless, but to varying degrees, they have priorities over what success looks like or what school they go to. And those things kind of change from family to family on value systems, and they're kind of all acceptable and they're not evil in and of themselves. And so, but underneath all that, you'd brought up that there's some things that you care on a biblical perspective that we're doing with our kids. What are some of those biblical perspective things that we're trying to teach our kids in parenting?
I think really kind of this idea of surrendering to yourself or denying yourself and just surrendering to Christ, right? And I think, all kids and adults and people in general, we're just naturally super self-centered, right? And so we come out of the womb and this baby's screaming at you like, feed me, feed me, feed me, right? And then they become toddlers and they're like, feed me, feed me, feed me.
And then those people parenting those adult kids are coming around being like, feed me, feed me, feed me.
Yeah. And they're very self-centered, right? Like, I want that toy, so I'm going to take it. And I think really like what I've been trying to foster in my kids is this idea of like dying to yourself and surrendering to Christ and following his will for you. But that doesn't happen like in a moment. That happens in a lot of tiny moments throughout the day. So, I think whether it's you wrong somebody and you ask for forgiveness or forgiving someone, sometimes that's hard for certain personalities to be like, hey, I forgive you for that way you wronged me. Noticing within our kids, when they're having a day where they're struggling, especially with 5 kids, somebody's having a hard day. There's never really a day where everyone's like, hey, I am on top of my game. I'm feeling happy. I'm feeling generous. And, even teaching my kids like, hey, do you see that your brother's struggling today? Like, what's something that you could do for them? Where we are naturally trying to take this focus off of ourselves. And the reason is because God wants you to be kind. He wants you to be compassionate. And just kind of trying to mold their hearts to see that our ways aren't best. If I think, I look back in my own life and all the times that I've probably gotten myself in the most precarious of situations is just because I was so self-focused. And so just continually like pointing them back to Christ. Like, what would God want from you right now? Where would God want you to take this decision? And I think as we get nearer to like these teenage years, that becomes a lot weightier because I'm thinking we're going to see if they've taken this to heart pretty soon because they're going to get a substantial amount of independence they haven't had before. They're going to have the ability to choose and say, this is what I believe, this is who I want to be, and they might not choose to go towards Christ. And again, that can be like really scary, but I think also like my prayers for my kids is that Christ will draw them near to him and that he will change and transform their hearts because he's the only one who has the power to do it. As parents, like we've just been giving these little kids, which I think is such an example of like Christ's love for us, that he would let us like take care of these little people and raise them up. But I think sometimes we get so focused on this is like a kid problem when we're parenting that we forget that like God's doing so much work in our lives in this process. Like if you think that you're patient, just have a kid, right? Like, or another one. If you have one kid and you think you're patient, have another one. It might show you maybe you're not. If you're not gracious or merciful, like, hey, you have a kid, like you're going to see there's areas of weakness in your life. And I think that that's very intentional by God to help cultivate us to become more Christ-like, right? And so as much as we're parenting our kids as we raise them, I think like God's parenting us in those same processes. And there was a quote from the book that I really loved on one of my mini note cards here.
Yeah, you got 13 quotes. You better get to them.
This one says, every struggle is an opportunity that is given to you by a God of amazing grace to get at those deeper issues for the sake of redemption, rescue, and transformation of your children. And God will give you everything you need to engage yourself in that deeper war. And I think that sometimes I forget that I'm learning as much as my kids day to day, and I'm just as broken, and I need just as much grace, and I need just as much forgiveness. And it's easy to approach parenting as like, I'm the parent, I'm the authority, I know what's best. But when you can stop and be like, man, like I'm the person in this house that's having the bad day today. Like I'm the one who's self-centered, and I'm the one who is struggling, like sinning against these people by being quick to anger or all those things. I think it helps give you a lot more grace to your kids to realize like we're in this together and we're all working towards the same goal of getting closer to Christ. Like I have in no way arrived. So I'm still working on that. And I think just like modeling that for our kids of like, we're like in this arm in arm together of just, working towards sanctification. It's the S words that get me.
You want to try any more S words?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, so you're talking about something that even Paul Tripp brings up, and I think that is probably in that book. I haven't read that book, but he brings up this idea of we are the authority, but yet we are also not perfect. And so talk to me a little bit, if you have anything on this or any of those note cards address this. What does it mean? What does it look like? How do you balance, or if there is, even if balance is the right word, how do you engage parenting as the authority of these kids put there not only by the government, but also by the government, but also more importantly by God with these kids to parent them so you're in authority over them, but yet you're not perfect. And God is still, like you had mentioned, kind of parenting you. There's kind of correction happening. There's sanctification happening in you. And so you're making mistakes too, but you're supposed to be an authority over them. What does that relationship look like?
Well, I think two of the quotes I have that I really like. The first one is, if you deal with a lack of character, You will not accomplish what God has given you to accomplish in the hearts of your children. And that one was super convicting to me, because I think about, all the eruptions throughout our day of, this toy's mine, or, he's sitting in my spot, which, by the way, we don't even have assigned spots at our table. Mm-hmm. We have like this big square table, and people kind of like naturally gravitate to like the same spots. But these kids pretend like there has been like their name written on certain spots.
Yeah, we get that in church too. There's pews. Someone will be sitting. We had a new couple just recently. They actually reached out to me and said, "Hey, I'm sitting in this spot. Is it okay? People keep trying to kick me out of that seat. Am I allowed to sit there?" I'm like, "Yeah, you can sit anywwer you want. Don't let those guys push you around."
Is it the piano bench?
The drum stool.
Oh.
Wow. All right.
There you go.
Go on.
And the other quote that I was thinking of says, if rules and regulations had the power to change the heart and life of your child, rescuing your child from himself and giving him a heart of submission and faith, Jesus would have never needed to come. And I think when I became a parent, I really thought that like, all I need to do is create rules and boundaries and be super consistent. And my kids are going to listen to me. That's all it takes, right? Mm-hmm. I've read the books. I've listened to whatever I had listened to. Remember that show, Super Nanny?
Oh, yeah.
I watched
some
that.
Some English lady comes in and like takes charge, put kids in timeout and stuff.
Yeah, so I was pretty sure like I was an expert at that point, because I'd watched that show.
Super Nanny.
I'm like, okay, they go on the mat for 1 minute for every year they are.
Yep.
So
I get put on the mat for 35 minutes at a time now.
I would love timeout.
Yeah.
Just
35 minutes on my bed?
Yeah. Please send me to nap time. Yeah. But I just really thought like that's all it's going to take to, raise these good kids. And again, my idea of good was like well-behaved, they have manners, they have friends that they're kind to, and all those things. And I think what I quickly realized was you can do all of the things that Super Nanny told me to do, and then my kids are like, I don't care. Right? And so again, if we bring it back to like, okay, well, what does Christ have for me as a mom? What does Christ have for my kids as they're growing? Your perspective really changes on what you're needing to do day to day. And I think really like it's just a process of growing. And each kid kind of grows you more, right? So
you're doing a lot of growing then.
I know. It's pretty exhausting. I need a nap.
Yeah. Go through some more of those. So just because of time, I'll bail on some of my notes. Take me through some of your notes there.
Well, I think my notes really come down to more as like parents in the trenches of this process of raising children. Because I think that what you find the more you talk to people about parenting is that they're like, this is really hard and overwhelming, and I don't like it as much as I thought I was going to, and it's a lot harder than I thought, and I don't know what I'm doing. And then...
But the truth probably is they probably at some point thought they knew what they're doing, and like you're saying, things go on, and pretty soon all of us parents start being like, it's not working.
Yeah.
And then we start panicking because the kids don't stop growing up. We can't take a time out with parenting. We can't take a time out with parenting. If we could take timeouts, a lot of things would be better. We can be like, hey, everybody stop thinking, let your brain stop changing, everybody pause, let me go get some help and come back. But just day after day keeps coming and keeps coming.
Well, and they dictate so much, right? They dictate whether or not you get to sleep at night. They dictate when you wake up.
Not me. I just
when you go to bed.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
For those listening, I'm very involved, Dad.
But suddenly your life goes from this like independent adult to this tiny person ruling your life. And you had this idea going into it that like you were going to be the one in control. And then suddenly as soon as they place the baby on your chest, you're like, oh my gosh, I don't have any control here, you know? And so again, I think going back to this idea that, you know, we can lead our kids and we can model things for our kids, but we can't choose Christ for our kids. And I think there's a lot of peace in that sometimes, where we are like, it doesn't matter if I take them to church every Sunday. We go to Bible study in the middle of the week. We do small group. We do all these things, devotions daily. There's still kids that sometimes grow up and they grow out of their faith and they leave the church, right? Even though their parents did everything that they could. And then there's other kids who grow up in households that never took them to church, who never spoke the name of Jesus and all that. And they grow up and they follow Christ wholeheartedly. And that wasn't the doing of their parents, right? It was the work of Christ within them and in their lives. And so I think for me, sometimes when I get overwhelmed with this idea of like, if I don't do A, B, C, D, E, the whole alphabet with my kids, and they grow up to not follow Christ, that's on me. And I think that logically, I know like that's not true. That in the end, God calls them to him, right? And they fall in love with Christ in their own way at their own time. But I hope that I can help them in that process and lead them in that process and model correct characteristics for them throughout the years that they're growing up.
Let me see if I can wrap my mind around that. Okay. So I'm going to be talking as I think, and that can be dangerous. Okay. So
it's my favorite thing about you.
So you're saying that there's a lot of responsibility in parenting, but there's some sort of relief knowing that the thing that really matters the most in the end, we don't have ultimate control over, because we are called into teaching our kids the Bible. We just read that verse, teaching them the ways of the Lord, teaching them to admire and adore the Lord, to fear the Lord, and teaching him his commands. But in the end, that's not an 1 + 1 = 2 scenario where if you do these things, this will happen and then this will happen. It's that we're supposed to do those things and then the Lord is going to do what he wants with those things. And so then we take another step back and look at ourselves as parents. And although there are several things that are very clear in Scripture that us as parents should be doing, that even as we parent, the same grace that saved us from lust saves us from impatient with our kids. And the same grace that saved us from being impatient with our spouse saves us from, or forgives us for being impatient with our kids. And so we're parenting in grace, although still there's the truck. We got one every season. I mean, every episode. So that even though there's this responsibility and we're to be doing these things, that there's grace in it, and that ultimately, if we do everything somewhat right, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will be called to the Lord. And if we do everything wrong, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Lord won't call him to himself, because he builds his church and we are these conduits for his word and likeness. And so we're trying to, in a sense, reflect who God is even in our parenting, in hopes that that will be part of what God uses to draw the kids to himself.
Yeah. And I think that, parenting is just our kids watching us get closer to Christ every day, right? And so I think that our job as parents is to do what's right and what God calls us to do. And that means do what's right and what God calls you to do in your marriage, in your friendships, when you go to the grocery store, when somebody cuts you off on the freeway, right?
These are watching and learning.
In everything. Yeah. And by the way, they will never repeat one positive thing you say, but you mess up one sentence and they will repeat that for weeks.
Yep.
Hey, they will tell their friends. Yeah. And then you have a bunch of toddlers running around.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
saying these things.
One honesty moment, man. I'm driving down Martin Lane. I'm coming up to 88. This semi truck makes a turn onto Martin Lane, and like literally, we almost got crushed by a semi truck. And I said one word that I've told my kids is not an okay word to say. And oh man, that's on my record now. I'm gonna have to live with that one word that I said.
Yeah.
Right when we almost died.
They wrote it down. The time, the date.
Yeah, they can spell it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So 2 of my quotes that I had that kind of go along with what you were saying. The first one is, God calls unable people to do important things because ultimately what he's working on is not your immediate success, but that you would come to know him, to love him, to rest in his grace, and to live for his glory. And the other is, successful parenting is not about achieving goals that you have no power to produce, but about being a usable and faithful tool in the hands of the one who alone is able to produce good things in your children.
It's like it's all about Jesus, even in parenting.
Even in parenting.
Wow.
Yeah.
Go on, keep going.
All
Give
right.
us some more.
Let's see. What else do we got here?
We got hungry listeners that are doing who knows what right now.
Well, let's see. What's a good one?
While you're looking at that, let me tell you something. A guy in our church, I think he'd be fine with this comment. It was Matt Simonson. So I was talking to him a couple of weeks ago, and he goes, it blows me away that you need a license to go drive a car. You need a license to carry a gun. You need a license to practice, medicine. You need a license to go sell insurance. But anybody can, parent a kid. There's no license needed. And he said it boggles my mind that something so important that anybody can do. You can be 14 years old,
yeah,
and be parenting a kid, and there's no training mandatory. Now we got some freedom activists about ready to lose their mind right now. I'm not saying it should be any different, and neither was Matt. The point is that like there's just not a lot of even people saying, hey, you do birth coaching, right? I don't know if I said that right, but one of the things that I've been able to sit there and listen to Emily talk about birth and stuff, and it's amazing. There's a lot of men and women that don't know their bodies or how thing works. And that's a pretty big process to be involved in. Similarly, with parenting, there's not a lot of people saying, hey, let's really hone in and be intentional at teaching our kids how to parent, or hey, our kids, they're in high school, let's get together a parenting class, or hey, before you have a kid, there's a bunch of these great parenting classes you can be part of. There's not a lot of people pushing that. It's like, hey, here's a kid, get going. I heard a comedian once say, you want to know what it's like having 4 kids? Imagine that you have 3 kids. And no, he said, imagine that you're drowning and then somebody hands you a baby. Yeah. He goes, that's what it's like having 4 kids. And there's no license for that. There's no suggested training for that. It's just kind of like, go for it.
Yeah.
It's a big deal.
I remember telling somebody one time, in the frustrations of my lack of a green thumb, that I can't believe that I'm allowed to be in charge of keeping children alive, and I literally kill succulents. Like, you don't even have to really water succulents. Like, that's the whole premise of them, is that they're like easy.
You'd think so. Yeah. I love wasting a good $15 on a succulent. Or, how many jasmine bushes have we bought?
Oh, it's my favorite.
Yeah.
I mean, I kill them every time.
Yeah.
And everybody's like, oh, they're really easy. No.
Not for everybody.
Not for me.
Not for everybody.
I mean, I guess if I have to choose a plant or kids, I'm glad that I can keep kids alive.
That's true.
That would have been worse
hey,
if I could keep a jasmine bush alive, but my kids were dying off. That's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I think your priorities are correct if you're raising kids well and your jasmine bushes are dying.
Yeah, but I was thinking there should be some license, like you're saying.
Yeah,
like maybe we should take this more seriously, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how much you prepare. You're not going to be ready.
Yeah,
to
that's
have
a good
kids.
point. That's a good point. Yeah, the feeling of failure in parenting is why there's hundreds of thousands of books written on parenting. Mm-hmm. So tell us some more about this. What you've learned over the courses of all your studies and being helped by people in parenting and helping others in parenting.
Well, I think maybe we talk about it as far as we vent about it, but we don't really sit and discuss this issue of like the emotions that come along with parenting, as far as like the sin it reveals in our life, right? Mm-hmm. This idea of like impatience or quick to anger or all these things where after a while it just kind of like beats you down. where you're like, I should be better at being patient at this point, right? 12 years into parenting, you would think like, we have checked that off the box of problems. Let's move on to the next one. And it's not. And so one of my cards is, when you're frustrated, mad, discouraged, unkind, abusive, bitter, joyless, vengeful, or irritated as a parent, you don't so much need to be rescued from your children. You need to be rescued from you.
Whoa.
And I think that
Whoa.
that's part of what's so convicting to me day to day, is that I can get so focused on how my kids need to change and the sin within them and how I need to fix that I forget, like, they're just watching me. And a lot of times mimicking a lot of the things that I'm doing. That doesn't mean if I was like perfect that they would be perfect. That's just not how it goes. But I think it's easy to get so focused on the issues that your kids are struggling with that we forget to like look in the mirror and see that own plank, right? And say, maybe I need to deal with that first. And also, maybe I need to be on the floor praying for myself just as much as I need to be praying for my kids. And sometimes I think I've been guilty in the past of forgetting to really like cover motherhood in prayer for myself, of being like, I can get so weighed down by like, I'm not good at this. I'm not doing a good job. I'm not adding up to what my kids need. That really God's like, yeah, that's the whole point, right? You were never able to do this on your own. That's why I created motherhood, so you could see that like you need me. And it draws us near to Christ when we realize that we have a complete inability to parent well on our own, right? Like, I think that motherhood more than anything else has shown me how much I need Christ in my day-to-day, and that when I fully rely on him, it really does like lighten my load of saying like, if he's the focus and he's the goal, then all I have to do is trust in him and follow him, and he's going to make that path for us. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. They're still going to fight. They're still going to be outside the gate trying to get in, right? Like, but I think we're able to do those hard things. There's a lot of times where I'll talk to moms that are just like, I don't want to do this fight anymore. I don't like waking up every morning and just fighting with children all day and going to bed and being woken up a couple times just so I can wake up again in the morning and fight with kids again. And you get so weary. And I'm like, but God literally addresses that, right? He's like, my yoke's easy. Like, bring it to me, right? And for me, parenting has been that one thing in my life that really has like focused me back to Christ constantly, of being like, you are not capable of raising these kids to love me without me.
You got to have that trust and faith that the Lord's work is at work, and that you're going to do your best. You're going to be prayerfully considering things. You're going to drench yourself in the word. Let's do this. We got to wrap this up. So we got like 6 minutes left. Let me go through. I got 3 points. If somebody were to say, hey, what are the grounding principles? Good talk, last 40 minutes. Great. And you do the same thing. You come up with, a couple things that are just grounding principles for the listeners as we're kind of like wrapping up here. I'll do my 3, you do your couple, and then we'll wrap up here. So the first one I put is parenting is providential. And what I mean by that is that the timing is important. And I think it's important because God designed everything that there is. And it's no mistake that in the Bible, there's this time between birth and marriage. We usually say 18 in our secular world or our culture, but I believe that it's between birth and when you're married. You have this time with your kids to be able to be the primary human influencer. And then also, it's no mistake that during that time, they are the most influenced So I think that it's providential in the sense that God says, during this time, I'm charging you to parent them from birth to their married. And then also during that time is the when they are most influenced. So I think it's providential. So we should remember that it's just a time. It's a phase that we have with them. Not that we'll ever abandon them, but that real instruction time. The Bible's very clear. When our kids get married, they become one with that spouse. And our first place is no longer first place. That spouse is. The second is, do not let the children construct a circumscribed environment. And what I mean by that, and that's actually Paul Tripp's words, but what he means by that and what I took from that is that we do our best, right? And then what happens is we'll take something we don't do anymore. Say, I don't go play poker with the guys every week anymore. And what we'll do is we will have, in a sense, categorized in our mind that our kids have created that limit or that constrained environment for me, that I can no longer do that. When really, I think people should be thinking, well, if you say your kids didn't do that, would you be choosing right now to go play poker once a week, or would you be choosing to be with your family? And not that you can't ever go play poker, but the idea is that there are times where we constantly think our kids are causing this to me, when really you're making that decision. You could go play poker with the guys every week, or you could go get lunch with the girls once a week. But in reality, there's times where we just choose not to, and we kind of blame our kids for it, when really what we're doing is making good decisions. And it's not because of the kids have created this constrained environment, and we don't want them to do that. We're in authority over them, and we've been placed there for a reason. And I don't know if I'll get to the quote in a minute, but I believe that there's a reason for that. But think through the things that you're doing, the things that you do and the things that you do not do. Don't let the kids kind of direct those things. Think through, would I be doing that? And for the poker, for me, no, I wouldn't be doing all those things that I'd like to be doing. I'd like to hunt more, but in the end, I'll hunt with my kids. This is a phase where I'm going to be with the kids, and I'm not going to abandon Emily every week to go do that all the time, maybe sometimes. But there's a limit I put upon there's a limit I put upon myself, and it's not my kids causing it. I think it's right. I think it's better. And so I do that. So don't live in that, because you start getting jaded towards your kids. I don't know if you know what I mean, but you start feeling jaded, or you create bitterness with your kids thinking they're causing all this stuff, when really you're choosing these things. And if they're things you should be doing, go start doing them. And if they're things you shouldn't be doing, be okay with you making a right decision not to.
There's also seasons though, right?
Sure.
Like, so when our kids were itty bitty, you weren't hunting as much, right? Like, we were home just in the trenches of like diaper changes and feedings and naps and all those things. But then, as they got older, that's something that you can involve them with, right? It changes and it morphs and it never stays the same. And so, those choices, it's not like a 18-year sentence, it's just like seasons that.
I'm going pig and turkey hunting Thursday morning. So there
Good
it
luck.
is. I haven't even told Emily till right now.
Good luck.
My third one is that parenting changes the world. And this is big. This isn't like some cliche, but this is real. Parenting changes the world. Remember, secular studies and biblical truth both proclaim that parents have an enormous effect and influence on who and what those little people become. The Bible tells us it'll have that effect. The secular studies say it will have that effect. Nobody disagrees that if you're a stay-at-home mom, or you're a stay-at-home dad, or you're teaming up really well, or you feel like you're in the trenches, it changes the world, and it changes and influences who that child will be and what they will do. And that's important. If you are at home with your kids, whether you're a dad or mom, I don't care, and you end up saying something or believing something that sounds like what I'm doing is not important, or I'm spinning my wheels, that's a lie from the pit of hell, I believe. Because there is so much intentionality, and we don't have time to get into, but even the whole idea of discipleship, that is happening in a huge foundational way in these kids' life. And I don't know if there's even a more important time to be doing it than when they're kids. And I think the Bible points that out. That's why we should be instructing our kids with these things. So we can't be believing that what you're doing is not important. That has got to be from Satan himself. Because when we step back and say, what does the Bible say are most important things? Glorify God, obey his commands, spread the good news, the gospel, and love God and love people. And those are, I think, our guiding principles, is that it's providential. There's timing with it. Don't let the kids start forcing you into what you're doing. Be thinking about what you're doing. So that way, if it's a good thing, you can be like, I'm doing this for a reason and the sacrifice is worth it. So you don't become embittered towards your kids. And then also, if there's something that you're not doing that you should, go and start doing that thing. And then lastly, it's meaningful. It changes the world. It changes these kids. And God calls us into it. And it is hard work, but it's worth it. One thing I wanted to, well, you do yours and I'll end with this quote here. You okay. Wrap us up here.
So my last little bit mostly is just more quotes from this book because I love it. But it's talking about how we're the ambassadors to Christ in our children's lives. And it says, the only thing an ambassador does, if he's interested in keeping his job, is to faithfully represent the message, methods, and character of the leader who has sent him. Your success as a parent does not rest on your authority, but on his. When your rule seems weak, you can rest in the reality that his rule on your behalf is never weak. And I think, not only is it important and valuable, but every moment Christ is doing something in your life, whether it's you as a parent or the kids that you're parenting, even just in our marriage as we navigate parenting together and those decisions, like there's so much growth and intention that's happening within our world that we never even really give credit to, of this intimate draw that Christ is doing in our lives, like moment by moment by moment, as we try to like raise up these little children. And so I think that it's easy to get bogged down by that day to day, but really remembering like what truly is happening and going on, and just shifting our perspective of like you said, this matters what we're doing. That doesn't make it easy, but it makes it valuable, can get us through like each day. And the verse that really I think has helped me a lot is 2 Corinthians 12:9 that says, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And so really taking like that burden of parenting off our shoulders again, and being like, not only are these children a blessing in our lives, that we get to be given this opportunity to raise children that belong to Christ first, but that he's sufficient to fill all those gaps and bring us closer to him in the end.
That's good. It's good. Well, you let me know in the end if this is in your book, but let me wrap this up with something from Paul Tripp here. He says one of the key aspects of us being parents is that we are authority, in the sense that God has placed us in this authority, and that we are not the authority of God, but that we are representatives of that authority. So anytime we assume authority or exert that authority, we need to be the picture of who God is in authority over us. So that would challenge us to exhibit the fruits of the Spirit into our kids, and so that they would see that. Speaking of being loving, patient, generous, sacrificial, disciplining us basically because we love them. That's what God does with us. And then he goes on to give this quote, and we'll end with this. He says, if my eyes ever see, my ears ever hear the sin, weakness, and failure of my children, it's never an accident. It's never an interruption. It's never a hassle. It's always grace. God loves those children. He put them in a family of faith. He will reveal their need to me as a parent so that I can be a tool of his authority and his truth and his wisdom and his grace. And then you mentioned this too, Emily. He says, the work will be done in little moments because change is a process and not an event.
That's good.
How's that sound?
Sounds good.
All right. Well, hey, thanks for joining us today on this podcast. We're glad you joined us. Hopefully this was helpful. Feel free to comment, like, and share any of the posts that allow that. And we'll see you again next time as we talk about what faith is. All right. We'll talk to you later.